The Chilean folk singer Jara was so popular that he was able to draw comparisons to US folk singers like Dylan. And so in that way, I actually think there's a distinction, and why her case even scared me a little bit more. He was an icon. He was a public figure. He was drawing audiences. And so in a way, again, his torture and murder are horrific and terrifying. But I liken that it almost, put me a little bit more at ease when I think about like my situation or anyone's situation. Like, we're not famous. Like, okay, we shouldn't be a target. But I think for the situation of Öztürk was so harrowing to me is that this is just a doctoral student. Like, I was once a doctoral student. Like, I have doctoral students that I work with and advise and teach. And so for her, as somebody who, again, was basically a no-name, as most of us are, I'm not much of a name. I would think that there was a little bit more protection. You're under the radar. How threatening could this be?
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015.
And I'm Maria Repnikova. I spent my early childhood in Soviet Latvia before moving to the United States, where I went to school in Vermont, and later in DC and the UK. I studied authoritarian regimes, propaganda with a focus on China and Russia, and more recently about how these countries project their image and diplomatic power in Africa.
Today, we are really happy to be speaking to Stacey Torres, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California in San Francisco. She's the author of At Home in the City, Growing Old in Urban America. But we contacted her for this podcast after reading an essay she wrote for The Guardian newspaper titled, I used to laugh at my Chilean father's paranoia about life in the US. Not anymore. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Stacey.
Thanks so much, Jeremy and Maria. I'm really honored to be here and excited to chat with you both.
Before we talk about the article and Chile's relevance to the United States, let's just do the ridiculous and sum up centuries of Chilean history in a minute or two. So here goes. Before the arrival of Spanish colonizers, Chile was inhabited by diverse indigenous groups dominated by the Mapuche. The Inca also controlled parts of the north of what is today's Chile. In 1540, the conquistador Pedro de Valdivia led an expedition of about 150 Spaniards into Chile, where he defeated a large force of indigenous warriors and founded Santiago, 1541. The Spanish colonial period lasted until 1818, when Bernardo O'Higgins of Basque, Spanish, and Irish ancestry and the Argentine José de San Martin declared independence from Spain. Chile is geographically a fascinatingly unusual country. It is essentially squeezed between two massive natural barriers, the towering Andes Mountains, which form an almost impenetrable eastern border with Argentina and Bolivia, while the Pacific Ocean creates the western boundary. This leaves only a narrow coastal strip and foothills for the country, averaging just 110 miles wide, despite stretching over 2,600 miles from north to south.
The country was relatively stable, but highly unequal during the 19th century and for much of the 20th century. In 1970, the socialist Salvador Allende was democratically elected, much to the chagrin of the CIA, which had been propagandizing and plotting against Allende and his Socialist Party and Unidad Popular coalition for years. As president, Allende implemented radical economic policies that polarized society and further enraged the CIA and Richard Nixon's government. Allende did not last long in power. On September 11, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet, aided by the United States and the CIA, staged a violent coup, beginning nearly 2 decades of repression and brutal human rights abuses that included extralegal disappearances, torture, and murder of dissidents, artists, anyone suspected of leftist sympathies and their families, and people denounced by neighbors or informants. As you write in your Guardian piece, Stacey, quote, the new regime tortured and murdered thousands of Allende's supporters. And because Pinochet feared free speech and a free press, public debate and intellectual freedoms, he specifically targeted writers, academics, students, and artists. Authoritarian regimes always do, end of quote. Democracy returned to Chile in 1990 with the end of the Cold War, and the election of Patricio Aylwin. Does that summary sound about right, Stacey?
It does. I'm glad you were responsible for it and not me. For a minute, I misheard and I thought I had to do that. So it was really wonderful. I think it hit a lot of right notes. Thank you for your attention to that, both of you.
Well, we did actually prepare it in advance. We didn't improv that.
Even still, and I'm going to bungle the quote, but Oscar Wilde said, like, if I had more time, I'd make it shorter or something like that. Yeah, so,
that's right.
And that is not my gift. So I'm trying and trying. So good job. Thank you.
Okay. Well, now let's get back to the present. And I'm going to read again from your Guardian piece, the opening lines, Stacey. Don't open the door to nobody, my father warned throughout my childhood, right up until the day he died. He trusted no politicians, no organized religion, and definitely no strangers knocking unannounced. Lately, his words echo louder than ever. So tell us about your father. What did he do in Chile? Why did he leave? And how did he come to the United States?
Really interesting. Yeah. So my father, who actually just Sunday was the 4-year anniversary of his death. So he hasn't been here. And I've been reflecting on his life and his myriad careers and jobs. Like many immigrants here in this country, he had about 6 jobs going all at once. And in Chile, so my father did not graduate from high school. He was born into the working class. He had a really difficult upbringing due to both of his parents abused alcohol. So it was a really hard scrabble upbringing to begin with. Somehow my father, with his silver tongue, managed to kind of talk his way into a job as a police officer, even though he didn't pass the test. So that he was a police officer in his earlier years, in his early 20s. And he lost that job. He got into a drunken fight and he lost the job. And it was his great shame that he lost this job. So, unemployment was on the increase and it was really soaring. And he didn't really have too many options. And he was really ashamed that he had lost that prized job for him. So he was traveling and he went to the north of Chile. And he worked in the Atacama Desert as a miner for 4 years. And this is something I didn't even know until my early 20s, that he was not only a miner, but he was there for 4 years. I mean, that's a significant chunk of time. And he told me, it was something that I was ashamed of. I saw that it was a dangerous work. There were people getting killed. There were people getting hurt. People were developing silicosis. So from that period of my father's life, he's like, look, I wanted to get out before I got harmed, sick, whatever. And so from there, he went back to his native city, Valparaiso, and he was able to pick up some work working on ships. And so he was one of the ships, brought him to Colombia and they were transporting goods to another country. There was one stint where he picked up a ship from Argentina, transporting cattle over to Europe, like all sorts of different jobs as a merchant marine. And so this took him all over the world. These are the years where Allende was in power. And so my father was kind of coming back and forth. He traveled to the Middle East. He traveled to Africa. He traveled all over to Europe. He traveled to the United States. And frankly, as I write in the piece, there were things about the political situation in Chile, even under Allende, who was really trying to uplift the lives of people like my father, working class people, poor people, peasants, etc. But there was a lot of economic scarcity. When the coup happened in 1973, September 11th, my father was in Venice. And he was traveling and heard it on this radio. They had gone to San Diego at one point, and he told me he looked out the ship's windows and he's like, okay.
Stacey, can I interrupt you and ask you, so when he heard about the coup, was he sort of politically aware at the time?
Yeah, so I would say, unlike many immigrants from Chile that I have met, especially in academic circles, that my father, he wasn't one of the sort of targeted writers, artists, intellectuals. He wasn't a dissident. So he wasn't very politically involved, but I think he was politically aware insofar as that this was a dangerous situation. The living conditions already were difficult in Chile for people who were poor. And prior to Allende and during his tenure, poverty was about, I think in the piece I cite, about 28.5%. It would go up after the dictatorship was installed. And so I think for my father, this just was kind of the writing on the wall that it's time to get out. So I think he was very concerned about just the political developments and the repressive atmosphere that would be there. But he still came back. This was, again, 1973. He did not immigrate to the United States until 1975. And he did that, I think, a mix of pushes and pulls to the United States, or pushes from Chile were at work. One, sort of just the economic situation in general. Two, I mean, my father was a single guy. He was actually the only person to ever immigrate from his family. And he was kind of adventurous. And so he basically, the next time his ship that he was working on pulled into New Orleans, in his words, he ran off the ship. He went into the shadows. He did not have his papers. He was undocumented. And, there were actually times he was apprehended, one particular time, by immigration. And he said, okay, I entered the country, in his words, illegally or undocumented. And if they deported me, they deported me. But somehow he was able to escape.
So to go back to his kind of warning to you about not opening the door, rather, and you mentioned he wasn't particularly political or involved in politics per se. Was he by nature kind of a suspicious man, or was it coming from his experience of observing just the nature of politics in Chile pre-coup and what he heard on the news? Like, how did he kind of get to become this more, I guess, cautious person, and to warn you to be that way as well, especially when it comes to your political expression and just your life in America in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as somebody who studies like what we call in sociology, the life course, and trying to understand how people become who they are, in my case, trying to understand how they become who they are once they reach older ages, I've thought about that. How does anybody become who they are? So my father would say, and maybe my naive sort of first pass at trying to understand Dad was like, oh, he's a suspicious person. He doesn't trust anyone. That's just the way Dad is. That was kind of growing up. But as I peeled back these onion layers of my father's experience and trying to understand, I think my father's distrust comes from a number of sources. One, again, this difficult experience that he had growing up where, both of his parents were heavy drinkers. And he, tells me stories about how he was like locked in a closet by his mother who would go out drinking. This was like a great shame, especially in a country like Chile. And so I think from the early beginnings, if you don't feel that solidity in your family, that the people that take care of you are people that, you can trust in some ways, or you feel betrayed, that's sort of one important influence. But the situation also in Chile, and just sort of growing up and politically and maybe not really seeing that you're benefiting, person that's in power, I think leaves its mark. And it reminds me a little bit of what I think we see here in this country with a distrust of institutions and experts. And I think that's been sort of longstanding and becoming more and more pronounced. And of course, I think contributing to the outcome of elections, like the second presidency of Donald Trump. I would also say, it's interesting because now that I think a lot about the people who leave a country and how they might be outliers. My partner's from Austria, and he always jokes, like, I'm not a typical Austrian. That's why I'm not there. That's why I'm here. And I think about my father, one thing that never really stood out to me was a kid, because I didn't know any better. My father was a lifelong atheist. He was very much like, I am against it. I am against religion. I am against the sort of being involved in kind of a Catholic church. I think, he would sort of, there's a lot of hypocrisy.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, being an atheist, as I am, does tend to make you suspicious of all authority, starting from the big one.
Right. And I think especially in a very, traditionally heavily Catholic country like Chile, to kind of go against that, even up to the end of his life, when my father was in hospice and they were like, well, does he want any spiritual advising? And I said, I offered it to him. I didn't think he was going to take me up on it. And I said, Dad, they're wondering if you want to talk to anybody. You never know in the final days if people just in case. And he said, no, like, I believe his words are, he definitely had some gesture like, fuck this bullshit. Like, no, I don't want that. So I think that it also inspired that distrust. And then I also think, that warning to us as we were kids, obviously, my father loved us, and even in his hard, difficult ways at some points, and wanted to protect us and prepare us. And that was one way of doing that. And just in the era that I grew up in New York City, I was born in 1980. So I always say it was like 3 years after, the city was bankrupt, and they have this famous New York Daily News newspaper headline, Ford to City, drop dead. Like, there was no bailouts for New York City. And I think the murder rate peaked, I forget, several thousands in 1990. So we were raised, in this apartment in New York City, like the apocalypse was unfolding outside. Like, I don't care especially if there's a priest, a nun, a police officer, a firefighter outside, do not open the door. You can't trust them. You might not know who they really are. They could be disguised. So this is very much in line with my father's ethos.
Your memories of your father and the warnings he gave you and the environment in New York City as well at the time reminded me of my own childhood growing up and transitioning to the US, but especially about immigrant families and, the post-Soviet generation of my own family with warnings and kind of the attitudes of secrecy and caution, coming from my relatives. Like my grandmother hid her Jewish identity for decades after surviving the Holocaust. Even ourselves, my family, the closest ones didn't even know that we are Jewish. My mother to this day doesn't say hello first when the phone rings. She just waits for them to introduce themselves first, just in case. And both grandma and mom often tell me to be careful in being outspoken about politics and my identity and just the way that I carry myself in the world. So when you talk about this experience with your dad and also just the experience of New York at the time, I was curious how you reacted to his warnings and did they seem completely absurd to you at the time in New York growing up, or did you find them to be compelling, or how did you kind of think about them at the time versus, I guess, as time passed?
Yeah, I'm going to borrow that one about answering the phone and not talking. That's a good one. There's power in silence, let them go first, which I'm never good at. I would say, for me, growing up with my father's warnings, and my mother was cautious too, but definitely, I think, a little bit more free-spirited. My mother was American. So I really inherited them, and I think I took to them. I was also the eldest daughter, so I'm the eldest of four. And so I think I was already a cautious child. My mother would describe me, like even when I was finally allowed to go outside by myself, I was already prepared with my like little whistle around my neck. My father gave me a can of mace. Like I was ready for my adventure to like go walk 2 blocks to the library. But God forbid, anybody's going to try to mug me. They would, be surprised. So I think I took a lot to heart, and I was really, in a way, kind of a little bit of a goody-goody, like a good daughter. Like, okay, this is what dad says. We better all be careful. And as somebody, again, who is the eldest in a family, my mommy's little, helper, helping to look after the younger kids, I really took this on. But there were times when I did feel it was like a little out of scale, a little out of the range. And I would kind of joke with dad, or it would be a little exasperated, like, oh, come on, like just sort of relax, especially, as I grew older. And as I mentioned in the essay, where I was excited to vote for the first time. There was an election. I was turning 18, I was 18. I think it was it was my first semester in college. And he's like, don't vote. They can collect your name. They can put it on a list. You don't know what's going to happen with that. And he was really, really, afraid of that. And I just thought this was like, come on, Dad. I'm in college. I'm learning about civics. This is an important thing for me to do. In the piece, I also mentioned that my father never became a citizen, so he didn't vote. And I remember even when we would be in, New York City streets during different election seasons, and people would try to approach him with voting materials or signing a petition. Even to this day, I'm always a little cautious thinking about signing a petition, or is this a scam on the street? I'm not signing or giving any information to anybody. But I remember my father, and he was a very gruff guy. First of all, don't approach him in public. You're a stranger. But second, he would just be like, get out of my face. Like, I don't vote. This does not apply.
I'm not giving you my information.
Yeah. Well, no information. And it's interesting, since the piece was published, that I had a number of people contact me, with stories about their own Chilean relatives and how they were understanding their family members better. And one person was saying, they mentioned social media and why they understood, kind of an aversion to it from this relative. And I never connected it, but I don't use any social media. I don't have a smartphone.
Do you still have U.S. citizenship? Do they allow that?
For traveling, it's probably just as well, right? I mean, I went to an immigration rights workshop at Berkeley a couple of weeks ago, and they were trying to counsel people through how to get through airport interrogations and turn off your phones and all of these things. Well, I don't have to worry about that. And my partner doesn't have a smartphone either.
Wow.
We're kind of on the extreme and strange people.
You are quite unusual.
It's for different reasons.
Stacey, can I get back to your essay? So one of the things you talk about in the essay is, I think, probably one of the most disturbing things that has happened in the last few months was the case of the Tufts doctoral student, Rumeysa Öztürk, I'm probably bungling the name. She was arrested in broad daylight by plainclothes ICE agents and bundled off in the manner of a disappearance in an authoritarian country. And you said that stood out for you. How did that remind you of Victor Jara, the Chilean singer-songwriter who, as you mentioned in your piece, is often dubbed the Bob Dylan of Chile?
Yeah. I mean, it really stood out for me. I would say, so on the one hand, the Chilean folk singer Jara was so popular that he was able to draw comparisons to US folk singers like Dylan. And so in that way, I actually think there's a distinction, and why her case even scared me a little bit more. He was an icon. He was a public figure. He was drawing audiences. And so in a way, again, his torture and murder are horrific and terrifying. But I liken that it almost, put me a little bit more at ease when I think about like my situation or anyone's situation. Like, we're not famous. Like, okay, we shouldn't be a target. But I think for the situation of Öztürk was so harrowing to me is that this is just a doctoral student like I was once a doctoral student. Like, I have doctoral students that I work with and advise and teach. And so for her, as somebody who, again, was basically a no-name, as most of us are, I'm not much of a name. I would think that there was a little bit more protection. You're under the radar. How threatening could this be? She wrote an op-ed in the student newspaper. I've had a lot of students, I've spoken with many groups of students about op-ed writing because that's kind of how I broke into writing. I started to write op-eds. I've even given workshops, and this is something that I've encouraged and people have wanted to know about. How do you disseminate your research to a broader audience and make it compelling and interesting? You can write an op-ed or you can write blog post or what have you. And I've even co-authored articles with my students, op-eds. One in particular, I have a former student. She's a legal permanent resident, not a citizen, from China. And some years ago, during the first Trump administration, we co-authored an op-ed that happened to be published in the New York Times about family migration because his policies were trying to eliminate that or severely curtail that. And so that situation of somebody who just, again, was writing something, expressing her opinion, and was to be whisked away by plainclothes bystanders thought maybe she was being kidnapped. It was just terrifying. And it really made me think too about, and it still continues to make me think about, what is the message I'm putting forth as somebody who is encouraged this kind of writing, engaging with broader audiences, if it could get somebody detained or it could get somebody deported. I mean, I would really have to think hard about co-authoring an op-ed, as I mentioned, with the student, especially if it's in a high-profile publication. I haven't come down one way or the other thinking about how I would do that, but it's certainly something that was not even on my radar years ago or even a few months ago.
Yes, this is really interesting to hear you reflect on this, because that's the case I also found myself extremely alarmed by as a fellow university college professor and as someone like you who appreciates op-ed writing and has done quite a bit of it and also mentored students in it, have given workshops and co-authored with students. It is quite striking to imagine that such an act that seems to be so, not mainstream, but just something that, we used to do so easily and excitedly, now is something we have to think about twice, maybe reconsider, maybe rethink if we write it at all or with whom we're writing, and of course for students to be protected, and just more caution all around when it comes to being an educator. So thinking about another kind of comparison that you mentioned in the article, you talked about the Chile's failed coup in June 1973 as eerily resembling the January 6th assault on the US Capitol. So I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit about that, how that resemblance came up for you and in what ways.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. So as much as I did study Latin American literature in college and then kind of wandered, maybe not away from it, but definitely I went down a sociology path with my doctoral studies. And so I'm still learning a lot of Chilean history. And I was really fascinated to come upon this first attempt at a coup that had happened just a few months before the successful coup in September 11th, 1973. And so I was reading about how it was almost like a dress rehearsal. Lieutenant Colonel Roberto Super led this attempt, and it was put down in a number of hours. But it was really fascinating to discover that after it was put down, that some of the people, the military, some of the officers that were involved, they were all pardoned. And then when the successful attempt occurred in September. So, I mean, they were punished first. And then they were pardoned as part of this successful coup. And then they were actually put in charge of guarding this stadium. Well, the stadium is Estado Chile and became a huge jail, detention center, torture chamber. And that is where that singer we were discussing, Victor Jara, was murdered. And so I came across some documents, especially from this lawyer who's a human rights expert and had written about this case. And according to her theory, she thought, well, you know, there was this vengeance kind of folded into like this sort of appetite for vengeance that had been folded into the events following. You know, you have these people who are now emboldened and angry, and they're in charge of detaining people that they're looking at as their enemies. So I thought that was really fascinating. And it just made me think and sort of shudder at the situation we're in now, where you have, you know, again, this insurrection and people, you know, being punished, prison, you know, in this country, and then pardoned. And now we're in a situation where, you know, Trump is back in power. And I definitely do feel that a lot of his social policies, if you want to call them that, are really, and rather than social policies, it's just vengeance, you know, and that there's a lot of potentially, you know, on his end sort of score settling. You know, it was interesting to see those parallels, and it jumped out at me in a way that I hadn't really understood that. And, you know, I appreciated sort of seeing a little bit more about that history and understanding that it was kind of a dress rehearsal for a more successful coup. And I think in this time, as I'm watching, you know, and listening to developments unfold, whether it's another insurrection or what have you, that all of these actions are kind of mini dress rehearsals to see, you know, how much we can push and how much we can test. I say we, but I mean the administration, how much they can sort of push the boundaries and what they can achieve and who they can convince and on and on. So it's just something that I was really happy to discover and slightly embarrassed that I didn't know about before.
Stacey, you talk about, you know, the Trump policies of vengeance, and another aspect, obviously, to his policies is making life easier for the rich people and making life more difficult for poor people, despite the fact that I think many people in the less well-off sectors of the United States have voted for him because they think he'll do something. In your essay, you write, just as in Chile, where poverty soared in the dictatorship years, the most vulnerable Trump voters will suffer most from rising prices and cuts to crucial social safety net programs. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I had more energy, I should have written 10 op-eds by this time now to all of the different aspects.
But there's time.
Well, unfortunately, I was just doing the math. I think we're like a little over 4 months into this new administration.
You might publish them in foreign newspapers, but there'll be time.
Well, I do have one that's supposed to be published actually in a San Francisco Chronicle about the tariff situation, which again is just something that it just reminds me of. I mean, look, there are lots of different issues in terms of the hollowing out of manufacturing and good manufacturing jobs in the United States and on. But it's really hurting, you know, everyday Americans, farmers, people who need basic goods and cannot afford, you know, to pay 300 times the price. So I think the tariff situation ongoing, it also, again, it just makes me feel a little like it's kind of, maybe this is going a little bit too far afield, but a sort of form of a domestic terrorism, this like chronic uncertainty for businesses, for people. When you don't know what's something going to cost, how can you plan? Even me, I was thinking, well, I need a couch for my apartment. Who knows? I don't know if this couch is ever going to come because who knows what it'll cost. And I could probably take the hit a lot better than a lot of other people, but still. So I think the tariff situation is something that, again, just reminds me of this kind of bullying and somebody pushing the boundaries to see what they can do and back and forth. You know, so we're all getting whiplash. The areas that I'm really, really concerned about are social safety net, and particularly Medicaid and programs like SNAP, food, you know, formerly called food stamps. I have a sister who's multiply disabled and has relied on. And I'm really very, very concerned about how this is going to hurt, again, the most vulnerable, including many of the most vulnerable that voted for Trump, who at the time thought, okay, they needed a change and were hopeful and were working with whatever information they had to try to bring that about. And it's just really sad. You know, I mean, think about the states, rather, many of the red states that perpetually are kind of on the list of highest rates of obesity, highest rates of chronic illness, highest rates of different poor health outcomes. Rural hospitals and clinics are really going to be hit hard by any cuts. Older adults in nursing homes, many of those older adults in nursing homes are funded through Medicaid. I actually have a sister who's not an older adult. She's 3 years younger than me, so she's in her early 40s, and she lives in a nursing facility, and it's funded by Medicaid. So those are the kind of things that I'm really, really concerned about. Where I feel hopeful, and I'll just add this, I think these hands-off protests have really brought out a lot of people who are like, oh, wait a second, this is not going to be good for me. I mean, look at all of the older people who are on the verge and wanting to retire, and the 401ks, they've taken such a massive hit more and more. And my father retired on a union pension, and defined pension benefits are mostly a thing of the past, unfortunately. So, many of us are having to have a 401k, and we're basically at the mercy, our whole livelihood, our whole, older years are at the mercy of what I see as a bully who's just kind of every day, it's a different story, and doesn't really have the long-term interests, I think, of most citizens in this country, save for very few wealthy people. So I'm very, very worried about that, as many of us are. But I was going to say, I've also been very heartened by the response of people at these hands-off protests who are, as somebody who studies older people, many of them are older. And so it's been really wonderful to see older people who are being affected standing up and rallying people to make their voices heard.
We'll go back to the theme of your research, the topics of your research just in a moment, but I just wanted to return to the topic of self-censorship here briefly, and especially the quote you have in your article about your job as a college professor. You wrote, quote, "I was once a college professor. It's been a meaningful ride, but if it ends, so be it. I'd rather say I used to be a college professor than, quote, I once stood up for my beliefs and values. Because what is good all this education if I haven't learned the most important lesson? As a college professor, I completely relate to the sentiments, this idea of kind of the precarity, I guess, of our situation. And I was wondering how you've been feeling since the publication of this article. Do you feel the job uncertainty or kind of the fear of losing it, or the sensation that anything can happen, and this past tense that you were using here? Does that kind of still apply to your thoughts and your mental processes about this career? I'm just, wondering, I think a lot of our listeners would be also interested to hear about this, especially about the career that's so stable, right? Being a tenure professor or tenure track is something we used to think is forever. Yeah. How do you think about these days?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. Well, you never know, and I'm sure you've experienced in your career, you never know how something is going to be received once you release it out into the world. And I've had articles where I was like bracing for, such a negative reaction or controversy, and it hadn't happened. And I had other articles where I wrote about something and it was actually picked up by Fox News, and I was inundated with like buckets of hate mail. And I have to say, I was really pleasantly surprised that I got so many wonderful notes of support from people who felt affirmed and really, I feel, wanted to hear somebody say, I guess, some of the things that I was saying in terms of standing up for free speech and expression. And so I feel still more committed than ever to speaking my mind, and especially not bowing down to worries about job security. So I don't yet have tenure. I'm going to file my packet this summer. And so I'm close approaching at least being able to go up for it or find another job. So, I think I've been on this probationary road for a while. And I think in some ways that has helped me really identify the values that I hold dear and to be committed to continuing to speak them, because I guess I don't take for granted that it's going to work out. And I think when I look back at my whole family's history and kind of the precarity that we have had, I always have backup plans from B to Z in terms of if this thing doesn't work out, including like, okay, I'll go to Trader Joe's, or maybe I'll teach this, or I will make this, or whatever it is. So I think in some ways it's more freeing, if you're not like, I must have this kind of job at this kind of university. I would say also, and again, I might be brave, or I might be an idiot, or I might be just not well informed, but at my particular university, I'm, on a health sciences campus, and these universities really rely on funding from the National Institutes of Health.
I was actually going to ask you about that next. What is the atmosphere like at UC San Francisco now? I mean, that must be one of the most liberal colleges in the United States. And as you'd mentioned, when we were doing the prep call for this, there are a lot of programs that used to be funded through NIH grants. So can you describe the atmosphere on campus right now?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I can, I'll sort of speak for myself. I don't want to speak for the entire atmosphere or what people are going through, but I think it's a tense time. I mean, we have students, professors her grants are being terminated, people who are losing jobs. Again, also, we've received a lot of encouraging messages about supporting our values, supporting our immigrant students, supporting our LGBTQ plus colleagues and staff. And so I think it's a fine line, but there's also pressures to maybe modify websites and language and on all those things. I'm not involved in that directly. And so, it's like this world is still in flux and we're not quite sure, what world is going to be and what the right strategy is. I mean, I think that's the thing. It's kind of like trying to build the plane while you're flying it. And it's challenging. So my research, and this is kind of the privilege of my position, as Maria was mentioning before, to be at least on the tenure track. You have some stability. You're not fired at will where you're like, okay, you're gone tomorrow. So I do have that. And then I have in my health sciences campus, I'm actually a hard money position. So I'm not funded fully by NIH money, which many people are. And so I think in that way, I've been able to have a great deal of privilege in this environment. But on the other hand, I also feel responsibility that because I do have some of these privileges and I have, American citizenship, that I should be able to continue to speak.
You have American citizenship now, Stacey.
Right. The birth certificate, who knows, maybe there was a Chronicle article. I don't have a subscription, even though I write for them sometimes. So I didn't click on it, but it was basically like all of our birth certificates may be useless. And who knows, but I still do feel I have more of an ability to participate and protest and write. Unlike my partner, I never would have thought that I would be worried about an Austrian immigrant, one of the more privileged sets of immigrants. And we're not married, but, we're sort of thinking about different things. And anyway, he has a green card. But a couple weeks ago, I was in New York at the time. He was in Oakland. And there were one of these hands-off protests happening. And I was going to forward it to him, and then I stopped myself. Because I was like, you know what? It's not a good idea if he goes to maybe this protest.
Right. And you don't want to know on his phone. We're sort of getting back to the topic of self-censorship. And I remember when we chatted again on the prep call, you mentioned that, one person that you talked to said that they're not worried about the threat of getting in trouble. But then after you talked, the person said that they didn't want you to use their name in anything you wrote. And so I know you just said you don't really want to speak for other people about the atmosphere on campus. But I mean, have you encountered a lot of that where people are kind of reevaluating what the boundaries of safe behavior are?
Yeah, I absolutely think. So in the first very early incarnation of this essay, there was a lot more about the NIH cuts and just the situation of universities. And I was looking for some people to interview, which were not easy to come by. And then I did happen upon a couple of people at UCSF who would be interviewed. And one person was saying, basically for their personal situation, they weren't as worried about, they were kind of caught in a communication pause for some grants that they had. They were basically saying, like, I'm in a more privileged situation where, I'm not as on the edge as other people. If it doesn't come through, they have a partner and they could be floated for a while. So I said, oh, well, that's really interesting. And then I was going back and forth with some details and they were like, oh, but could you not use not even any name? It wasn't even just like a first name. It was like no name. And I was, it was eye-opening just to see that when sort of push comes to shove, that it was something that they were concerned about. And of course, I honored that. And so I think all of us are trying to kind of evaluate, even interpreting, what does this communication mean? Like this request from this administrative entity on campus, like, what does it mean? Should we give this information? Or maybe it's like the less is more thing. Like we have to provide some kind of information, but maybe we don't provide every single detail. And it's challenging. And again, I'm not so advanced in the kind of higher bureaucratic levels. There's many more things that people are juggling. But I think it's kind of a time of, self-consciousness in the sense of being sort of like, okay, like really, I'm already an overthinker. Many people in academia are overthinkers. And then again, combined with my dad's sort of, childhood, like drilling us to be extra distrustful, I'm kind of like, what is this? I mean, I'm the person that if I get any kind of email, I'm hitting the fish alert right away. I'm like, I don't know, like these people, they're totally legitimate, but I'm reporting all of them. I would just say that it's really challenging. People even that had sort of said, okay, like my strategy is going to be to lay low, whatever that meant for them, lay low. And they still have their grants terminated. It's really hard to anticipate what the strategy is. And so I think for me, everybody has to kind of try to make the calculation for themselves. And it's hard because you just don't know. But I think for me, I need to sort of remain authentic to myself, whatever that means. And I need to continue to do what I can. And many people are. And maybe it's a little bit more vocal than some people are comfortable with. On the other hand, I look at, again, I'm not Ms. Moneybags over here. It's not like, oh, just like let my job go to the wayside. But one of the things that I think also gives me a little bit more privilege in the way, well, one, I think my lifetime of just being working class and poor, I'm like, I know how to be poor. I can be poor again for a while. Like I'll figure it out. Two, I don't have any children. I've decided not to have children. And so it's not like, oh, okay, wait a second. Like I have 4 children to support now. I better, lay low and hope for the best. And so I think that gives me a little bit more flexibility and freedom.
And going back to your professional fields, which is not about authoritarian politics or the history of Chile, but it's actually sociology and the study of aging and dementia. You talk to a lot of older adults, right, in your professional research. Do you talk to them about how they got by in earlier periods of upheaval and uncertainty? Did any strategies or practices especially stand out for you from their experiences that you could share with us?
That's really interesting. So the older people that I spent so much time with, I guess they would be part of what we would call the silent generation. And so these were people that sort of were born a little bit before like the Depression. They might have come of age. World War II was definitely a very prominent, huge catastrophe that they had to deal with. Even if they weren't in Europe, they lost family members who were fighting. They had to deal with the situation here, being terrified and fear, dealing with rations and all sorts of other things. And that's just one example. I mean, I think especially the people I spent time with who were more, working class, modest income. So again, definitely had gone through individual hardships and had just lived to a certain age where, like one of my older participants would say, all my friends are dead. At a certain point, you've got to develop resilience. And they did. And I would say, some of the things that they talked about, and they didn't identify it as like, this is my strategy for getting through life and getting to an older age. Humor was huge. I think, especially when they would kind of reminisce with each other. So, I'm an ethnographer, spent a lot of time with them in their hangout spots, which was like an old bakery and coffee shop and around the neighborhood. They would just, talk about, they would also just, it's sort of strategy currently just for getting through hard things. They would make jokes, dirty jokes, laugh, just kind of take joy in the absurdity sometimes of life, whether it was in the past or the present. They went to movies. That was a huge escape for people who were coming of age at the time of World War II and, other wars that happened. A few of them had served in Korea. So, there were lots of things they had to go through. So music, movies, humor, the things that we do. And that's also a way to kind of be a little subversive, in a time when if you feel like you can't really speak directly, but, you can maybe put it in a satire like, Star Trek, science fiction movie. And then I would say too, just again, good old fashioned kind of coming together, face-to-face interaction, talking, sharing tips. Like there's this woman who actually just passed away a couple months ago at 95. She was a dear friend. I knew her, since my 20s. And she would always say, when her brother, she was, born in Brighton Beach and lived in Sheepshead Bay, Jewish American. And when her brother came back from World War II, there was a severe housing shortage. And so she would tell stories about, again, people scouring the neighborhood and trying to kind of give each other information. And so I think that that's very, powerful for building solidarity, for coming together, for sharing information, for organizing. And a bigger movement is made up of smaller movements. So I think those are the main things that jump out to mind when I think about older adults and resilience and kind of giving me hope for how we can get through this time.
One of the things Maria and I have bonded over, I think, is the sense that we felt this before What's in There. We felt the nervous tingling that makes us feel that things could go very wrong. And perhaps the best word I've learned for this feeling is from Jeremy Barmay, the eminent sonologist, who was the first guest on the Rhyming Chaos podcast. His parents fled Nazi Germany just on time. and attributed some of the reason that they left in a timely fashion to what the Germans call fingerspitzengefühl. Of course, they have a word for it, which means literally fingertips feeling and an intuitive instinct, a situational awareness, and the ability, I guess, in modern vocabulary to sense the vibe shift just before it happens. Do you think your dad gave you fingerspitzengefühl? And if he was still alive, what do you think he'd be advising you right now?
It's interesting. I'm going to have to bring this one downstairs to my partner when we wrap up, my Austrian partner.
But don't use my German pronunciation.
I like to think, I guess I think about it as spidey senses, maybe, what's kind of going on.
That's the American equivalent, I guess.
Right, yeah,
sense.
exactly. Yeah, it's maybe not as good. I like the German stuff better. I would like to think that mine are sharp, but then sometimes I'm kind of an emotional person and I want to see what I want to see. And I want to put maybe some rosier glasses on. And so sometimes I don't even trust myself, so that's why I'm always going back and forth. Like, is it time? Is it time? I was chatting with a colleague at another university from Chile, actually. She's about my age. So she did not live really in the dictatorship years, I don't think. She was saying it's really hard to tell when it's time to go. What are the vibe shift? What's going on that it's like, okay, it's like time to, the go bag is ready. I do think, though, that my father, one of the things, maybe my inheritance from him to help me through this time and to maybe gauge some of the developments, my father was really a good observer of people. To the point of being nosy, and I guess I am too. And, it took me a long time to figure this out because, my father didn't go to college. And so it wasn't so clear to me, I went to college, have a doctoral degree. How did I get to my profession? It wasn't like my father was a teacher and I became a teacher or something. But my father was, had many different jobs, including he retired as a doorman and he was an elevator operator in New York City before that. And he had to interact with people and he had to watch them a lot and observe them. And so I feel like, in my own work, I'm constantly doing that, observing people, I'm taking notes on them, I'm paying attention. And so I really feel that that's kind of my father's gift of sort of observational powers, paying attention. And I think in this time, there's so many competing distractions for our attention and they're hungry. I'm no expert on the media, but thinking about the things that, for instance, like a Donald Trump will throw out. We're like, well, we're paying attention to this, but maybe we really need to pay attention to that. And so I think really trying to marshal our, observational powers and our powers of preserving our attention is really important. That's why I don't have the smartphone, because I would be addicted to having a computer in my pocket. So that's where I've tried to draw the boundaries. Okay, I have a laptop. If I need to check the internet, there's a time and a place for that. And then when I need to go out and look at some trees and take a walk, there's a time and place for that where I don't need anything distracting me.
How do you fly without a smartphone? This is sort of off topic, or maybe it's not actually, because more and more people might want to actually fly without a smartphone.
How would a smartphone even come up and flying? You mean to scan the boarding pass or to check in?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't used a paper ticket in years.
Yeah, no, you print it out. They've got a kiosk. I go to Southwest. I print out that boarding pass. I check in with the laptop. Yeah, so it's fine.
Well, thank you, Stacey. This has been such an interesting conversation, and we've covered quite a lot, from mining in Chile to dictatorship to getting on a plane without a smartphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stacey. It was a fascinating chat. Thank you for joining us. And the Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you.
Thank you.